Victorian prisons were built to break the will of anyone who entered. Prisoners faced relentless hard labor, suffocating isolation, and punishment so extreme that surviving them could feel like a miracle. This video dives into first-hand accounts and historical records to reveal the brutal reality of these institutions. From the damp and disease-ridden hulks floating on rivers to the back-breaking labor on the treadmills of Pentonville, this is life behind bars as described by those who lived it. The prison hulks were decrepit warships moored in harbors, repurposed to hold hundreds of convicts in conditions described as a floating hell. These hulks were a stopgap for overcrowded jails on land, but for many, they became a death sentence. The Defense, one of the most infamous hulks moored on the Thames, housed over 500 prisoners, crammed into dark, suffocating decks. Hammocks hung so close that they overlapped, creating a patchwork of canvas beds that swayed over filth-covered floors. Disease stalked every corner of these ships. Typhus outbreaks wiped out scores of prisoners within days. New arrivals, already weakened from land prisons, often succumbed to the infections festering below deck. Now, guards rarely ventured into the lowest levels, where the damp and decay mixed with the unending groans of the sick. One prisoner, Thomas Larkin, recalled how he was sent to the lower deck for refusing to work. The air was so thick that breathing felt like inhaling smoke, and his skin blistered from the damp. The water surrounding the ship glistened with human waste and the bodies of the deceased, tossed overboard with no dams given. Conditions were not confined to illness. In 1857, a fire engulfed the Defense in the dead of night. Flames tore through the wooden hull, trapping inmates below deck. Guards, reluctant to risk themselves, barred escape hatches to stop prisoners from rushing out. Desperate convicts used hammocks as ropes, climbing into the inferno rather than staying to burn alive. Survivors who escaped the blaze emerged with blackened skin, coughing blood as they collapsed on the dock. The wrecked hull sank slowly, its charred remains drifting downriver as a grim warning. The hulks operated like factories of despair. Prisoners were hauled ashore daily for labor in dockyards, shackled in pairs and flogged for the slightest delay. Escape attempts were rare, but when they occurred, they were audacious. One group tried to swim to freedom, using barrels as floats, only to be shot from the shore. For those who left aboard, life was an unending nightmare. Their survival depended on avoiding disease, punishment, and the whims of fire. Inside Pentonville Prison, the treadmill stood as a symbol of relentless punishment. The device was a massive iron wheel with wooden steps, set high enough that prisoners needed to lift their knees to climb. The grind lasted for 6 hours a day, broken into 15-minute intervals of climbing and resting. Guards stood ready to tighten the crank mechanism, making the wheel heavier if they suspected anyone was slacking. Prisoner accounts describe the way the treadmill drained their strength. Edward Foster, sentenced for theft, recalled how the unyielding rhythm of the machine shredded his boots and bruised his legs. Falling wasn't uncommon. The sharp, grooved edges of the steps left deep gashes in anyone who lost their footing. When a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, guards dragged him aside, threw cold water over his face, and forced him back onto the wheel. Refusal to continue meant days in a dark cell with nothing but bread and water. Now, the treadmill was more than labor, it was a psychological assault. The masks prisoners wore blocked peripheral vision, making sure they couldn't look at each other. The endless creaking of the machine paired with the clinking of chains created a soundscape of misery. At night, those noises haunted their dreams, waking them in cold sweats. Some inmates sought to sabotage the device. One group secretly jammed pebbles into the gears. Their act was discovered when the treadmill screeched to a halt, flinging prisoners into the guards. The ringleader was flogged in front of the others as a warning. Another prisoner attempted to feign illness, limping dramatically, but his act earned him an extended sentence. The treadmill wasn't confined to the yard. Prisoners were sometimes made to turn cranks indoors, blindfolded to disorient them further. Guards tightened the cranks to create unbearable resistance. For those who endured Pentonville, the treadmill left physical scars, chronic pain, and a loathing of its relentless mechanical grind. Inside Victorian prisons like Millbank and Pentonville, solitary confinement wasn't punishment. It was torment, stretched over weeks, months, or years. Each prisoner was locked in a narrow, suffocating cell, barely wide enough to stretch their arms. A single slit of light from a high, barred window revealed rough stone walls. Meals were shoved through a hatch. Prisoners who tried to speak to guards or neighboring cells were met with silence, or worse, a sudden blow from a truncheon. The silence was the worst. Some prisoners spoke of hearing the scrape of their own nails on the walls as they clawed through hours of solitude. William Hargrave, locked away for theft, began to hallucinate after 90 days of isolation. He recounted how the muffled steps of a guard outside his door felt like the pulse of the walls themselves. His sleep became fragmented by dreams of endless corridors filled with whispers of unseen men. Desperate for connection, some convicts invented ways to communicate. They tapped messages through the stone using spoons or bits of metal scavenged from their cells. One man named Fletcher was caught trying to scratch words into his cell door. The punishment was swift: 2 weeks in total darkness with bread and water as his only sustenance. Physical punishment supplemented the mental anguish. Guards monitored inmates' compliance with strict schedules. Prisoners were forced to stand motionless for hours during inspections. If they shifted weight or failed to keep their heads down, a leather strap across the back of the legs left painful welts. For one guy named John Carr, the strain of this posture caused his knees to buckle after a month. Isolation often destroyed prisoners long before their sentences ended. Some slit their wrists with shards of pottery or strangled themselves using threads pulled from their uniforms. Others endured, emerging pale, gaunt, and forever haunted by the silence. The doors of their cells could open, but the memories of those walls followed them wherever they went. Victorian prisons maintained control with punishment so harsh they bordered on barbaric. The whipping post stood as a constant reminder of the consequences of defiance. Prisoners were tied, stripped to the waist, and lashed with a cat-o'-nine tails until their backs were raw and bleeding. During one incident at Dartmoor Prison, John Bryce received 50 lashes for striking a guard. Witnesses recalled how his screams echoed through the courtyard, while the prison doctor counted each stroke, ready to intervene if Bryce collapsed. He didn't, though he was carried away unconscious afterward. Other punishments were designed to break the will without drawing blood. The crank, a pointless labor device, was fitted with a dial that guards could adjust to increase the resistance. Some prisoners turned it thousands of times in a single day, their arms trembling by nightfall. Failure to meet a quota meant an even harsher punishment diet. Riots erupted when the collective misery boiled over. In 1856, inmates at Dartmoor rioted after being served spoiled meat for weeks. Using utensils and improvised clubs, they overwhelmed several guards and set fire to the laundry facilities. Smoke billowed across the moors as guards rallied, armed with bayonets. When the riot was put down, prisoners were lined up and made to watch as ringleaders were dragged to solitary cells. One of the most infamous incidents occurred at Newgate Prison, where a convict used a hidden file to free himself and several others. They overpowered guards with iron bars before making a break for the outer gates. Their attempt ended in chaos when warders opened fire, killing 2 escapees and wounding others. These punishments and rebellions demonstrated the raw tension between inmates and the system designed to crush them. The scars they bore, whether from the lash or the trauma of a riot quelled by force, became permanent reminders of their time within those walls. Executions in Victorian prisons turned death into a public performance. At Newgate Prison, the gallows rose above the yard like a grim stage, its presence a daily reminder of the end awaiting the condemned. Crowds gathered outside, swelling into the thousands, eager to witness the gory event. Vendors hawked food, drinks, and even sketches of the soon-to-be executed. The air buzzed with anticipation, like a festival with a noose at its heart. Condemned prisoners locked in their cells on the eve of their executions often spent their final hours trembling or praying. Guards stationed along Dead Man's Walk kept watch as the prisoners shuffled toward the scaffold. John Bellingham, hanged for assassinating a government official, was described as pale and trembling, yet muttering to himself as if rehearsing his defense one last time. The crowd roared when he appeared, their cheers drowning out the prayers whispered by the chaplain beside him. Some executions were so dramatic they became legends. In one instance, a prisoner named Henry Stone tried to delay his hanging by fainting on the steps. Guards splashed him with cold water, hoisted him upright, his legs too weak to support him. When the trapdoor finally released, the crowd surged forward, straining for a better view as his body dropped. The executioners themselves, like the infamous William Calcraft, wielded their ropes with practiced efficiency. Calcraft had his own style, using a short drop that ensured the condemned died from strangulation instead of a broken neck. Witnesses often heard the choking gasps of the dying, a sound that silenced even the most rowdy onlookers. Public executions ended in 1868, but the spectacle continued inside prison walls. Witnesses invited to these private hangings included journalists and officials. In one such case, a journalist fainted as the noose was tightened around a prisoner's neck, the sound of the trapdoor opening echoing through the chamber. Each hanging left its mark. not only on the prisoners but on everyone who watched. The clatter of chains, the crowd's murmur, and the sickening finality of the drop lingered long after the bodies were cut down. Thanks for watching Nutty Productions. What else do you want to learn about the Victorian era? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, ring the bell, share this video with a friend, and all that stuff to stay up to date on all the nutty stories from humanity's past.